Hey class, welcome back. Last week we covered a ton of history. We started at the very beginning of the Bible. We got all the way up to the fall of the northern and the southern kingdoms of Israel and Judah, respectively. This week we're going to try to accomplish just about as much, not quite as much. I'm going to try to keep the lecture a little bit shorter this week. We don't have quite as much to cover, but still there's going to be a lot to understand. And again, I'm just going to be having to hit on the highlights, which is hard and frustrating for me. But it's important for me that you get a full survey of the Jewish history, basically from the beginning until the modern time. Imagine trying to understand the United States, a political issue or a social issue, without understanding the history of our country, where we came from, who we are, where we're going. And so, for an introduction to Judaism class, I think it's hard to just jump right into belief, saying, Judaism is a monotheistic faith, Judaism believes in this, etc., or practices in this way without understanding the history and the context. And so that's why we're going to be spending the first several weeks, as I've already mentioned, talking about the history of the Jewish people, so that when we get to the principles of belief and faith, and etc., we'll be able to understand it on a deeper and more significant level, with the goal of having a broad understanding of the Jewish people and history by the end of this semester. So let's jump right in. We'll start talking about the Jews in captivity. Now, this is a recurring theme that we'll get to come back and forth to throughout the semester, throughout especially these first several weeks talking about history. Periods of time in which the Jews are under their own control, and times in which they are controlled by outside influences and forces. It becomes a very significant theme to the trajectory of Jewish history. Let's talk about the Babylonian conquest. So the Jews are taken captive in the year 586 BCE, carried up into the land of Babylon in the north. And we have this very significant Psalm 137. This is taken from the King James Version of the Old Testament, but it's the same wording as the Hebrew Bible. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. We hanged our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof. For there they that carried us away captive required of us a song, and they that wasted us required of us mirth, saying, Sing us one of the songs of Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her cunning. If I do not remember thee, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth, if I prefer not Jerusalem above my chief joy. So isn't this emotional? It's very longing. It's a people that have been torn away from what they know, from who they are, from this connection to God. The great temple that was a significant symbol of Jews' providence and their connection to God, this temple that was built as a monument to God and his grandness, is torn down and destroyed by a kingdom of the world, by the Babylonians. And Jews are left to wonder, how shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? How do we continue to be the Lord's people when we have been removed from this land that he has given us? So you see this deep angst and this deep sadness that the Jewish people are facing. And again, it becomes very indicative and representative of the Jewish people in captivity and in dispersion throughout the world. So understanding ancient history a lot of times is understanding the interaction and interplay between empires, the rise and fall of empires. And basically, outside of the control of Judaism, of the Jews, the Babylonian Empire eventually fell to the Persian Empire. And so the Jews, the trajectory of their history was changed significantly because of this larger geopolitical event that took place outside of their control. But let's talk first, before we get to that, a little bit more about the Jews in captivity. One of the significant things that the Babylonians did is that they took the elite among the peoples that they had conquered, the youth, the rising generation, and they would introduce them into the courtly politics. And that's how Daniel, a very significant figure in Jewish history and in the Bible, came into connection with the king Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the Babylonian Empire. King Nebuchadnezzar had this significant dream where he sees this statue built out of different building materials. There was gold and silver and bronze and clay, etc., all the different appendages of the statue built out of different materials. Daniel, it was given and known to him that that was a representation of the kingdoms and the empires of the world. And then there's this small stone cut out of the mountain without hands, representing the divine providence surrounding this particular stone, or the kingdom of God rolling forth and eventually crushing this statue and all the kingdoms of the world. So Daniel gives this interpretation to King Nebuchadnezzar, and in some ways he's basically prophesying, as the Jews would see it, the rise of their ultimate rise and renewal to power of their kingdom, and of their covenant with God. So Daniel is also significant in he's cast into the lion's den. And I don't just tell this story because it's an interesting biblical story a lot of people have heard, but Daniel, for failure to worship the king and the gods of the Babylonians, is thrown into the lion's den, where the lions are tamed by God, and Daniel survives. Same thing happens with Hebrew young men, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, who are thrown into a fiery furnace and protected by God as well. So these miraculous events are significant to the Jewish people in understanding them in captivity, and in their continued belief that they remain under the covenant that God has given them. They remain his chosen people, his protected people, even though they are outside of their element. They're outside of Israel. They're outside of the land of Jerusalem. They're away from the temple. The temple's been destroyed. Yet still, God is protecting and preserving his people. Now, Persia eventually conquers the Babylonians, and Persia becomes the new controlling power. This is extremely significant because the Babylonians had a different way of dealing with their conquered peoples. As I mentioned last week, they would transplant their people and move them away, and take them up in captivity into Babylon. And that's why Babylon became sort of this cornucopia of a lot of different peoples that all had this influence, and were all brought into kind of the politics of the time. Now, Persia did things differently. They allowed a certain amount of self-rule. So shortly after the fall of the Babylonians to the Persians in 539 BCE, when that happened, just a year later in 538, there was the Edict of Cyrus, who was the leader of the Babylonian Empire at the time. And this was later called the Edicts of Cyrus, but essentially it was permission given to the Jews to go back and reestablish repopulate their ancestral land in the land of Israel. Now, significantly, a lot of the Jews had established their lives in Babylon, and not all Jews. In fact, the majority of Jews stayed in Babylon, but a large number of Jews, roughly 40,000, a little over 40,000, came with the first kind of group back to descend back down into the land of Israel and repopulate the land. One of the significant characters and figures of that time is Ezra. Ezra is referred to throughout the Hebrew Bible. Ezra and Nehemiah are two significant figures during that time. But I want to talk about Ezra for a minute because he's very often referred to as the father of Rabbinic Judaism, or the father of Judaism, which is basically the religion that came out of the Jewish people. He's sometimes called the second Moses. And the reason he is because Ezra established or recodified the importance of the Jewish law, reestablished the importance of Jewish law in Jewish practice, religious practice. And so the law was given to Moses on Mount Sinai, established, but according to Ezra, the Jews had strayed essentially from the import of the law, and so he reestablished that and the importance of the Torah in the first 5 books of Moses in terms of studying and analyzing. So Judaism is often called a literary religion, and perhaps it started around this time when Ezra basically created this and reestablished this connection to the Torah as being the foundational kind of document out of which the law comes. So very important. I also put on here Jewish exclusivism. Now, I don't know that that's the exact correct word, but many peoples throughout time have faded out of existence, not because they were lost to time, not because they were conquered, but because they simply intermarried with the world around them, and they lost their identity in that way. That has not happened with the Jewish people, and one of the reasons why is the influence of Ezra. Many of the Jews that returned back to the land of Israel, many of the Jews that were in Babylon, had intermarried with outside Gentile being the term that refers to non-Jewish individuals and spouses. So Ezra, he comes a number of years after the Jews have returned to the land of Israel, and he sees the men of Israel, many of whom are married to outside wives and have outside children, and he challenges the men of Israel to leave their Gentile families, to reestablish kind of the exclusive covenant that they have with God, and to kind of maintain their Jewish identity. Now, I make no judgment statement as far as that, but that is a significant part of what helped preserve the Jewish people throughout time. Their ability to maintain this insular, sort of inward looking community allowed them to survive in very difficult situations that we'll talk about in weeks to come, as Jews were the minority in lands dispersed throughout the world. So let's talk about the building of the new temple. This is very significant. Zerubbabel, who was a descendant of the Jewish leadership that was carried into captivity, was allowed to come back as the governor of Judah under the control of the Persians. He laid the cornerstone for the temple. The temple was rebuilt in 516 BCE. Essentially had the same function as the Temple of Solomon, but very modest, much more modest, and very kind of relatively small. Another important part was trying to reestablish the high priesthood, or the authority. Many of these priests had intermarried and things like that, and their lines had become kind of diluted and things like that. And so that was another key area in which Ezra was involved, is reestablishing the authority of the leadership for the cult of the temple. So imagine, trying to, after several decades, to reestablish this area of practice that many of these individuals aren't even familiar with, and weren't even a part of. And so to try to reestablish that and recreate it, it's very fascinating, but very significant and important to the continued development of the Jewish people. Now, let's talk about the post-biblical period after the reestablishment of the Jews in the land of Israel and the control over the city of Jerusalem. As I mentioned before, ancient history is a clinic in the understanding of empires and how they came to affect and influence each other. And that same thing happened again with Alexander the Great and the rise of the Greek empires throughout the land, and the introduction of the concept of Hellenism and Judaism. Hellenism is basically a word that means influence of the Greek influence, or Greek philosophy, Greek standard of living and life, and influence on the world and the cultures around them. And there certainly was a great influence of Hellenism on Judaism. And we could talk for weeks about Hellenism and Judaism. Unfortunately, you're just going to get this little snippet to say that around this time, there became a lot more influence from outside sources in the development of the Jewish identity, and the way in which Jews lived their lives and practiced their faith. Now, this influence actually extended to the temple of the Greek Empire that was controlling over the land of Israel at the time, following the conquest of Alexander the Great and the centuries that followed that, was an influence where the Greeks actually took over the temple and began sort of sacrificing unclean animals and basically doing whatever they could to demonstrate their control over the Jewish people, over the land of Israel. And it basically pushed things too far, and it actually led to a Jewish revolt and rebellion led by a man by the name of Judah Maccabee. He came from a family called the Hashmoneans. Maccabee was a nickname that was given to the family, meaning a hammer. So basically, the hammer of God. Judah Maccabee leads a revolt against the Greeks, kicks the Greeks out of Jerusalem, and starts this basically 6-year war in which the Jews defeat the Greek influence and reestablish their kingdom. First time this has happened since 586 BCE, when the Jews were conquered by the Babylonians, and now around 161 BCE, they are back under their own control. So 400 and a little 20 years later, Jews have their own kingdom once again. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't last too long. It lasts just about 100 years, but the Hashmonean dynasty is a significant part of the Jewish story. Um, Let me just say a little bit about the influence of the Maccabees. This is where the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah comes from, and the story is that once the the Maccabees and the revolting Jews cleared out the temple was defiled, and they actually had to reconsecrate the temple. There was only enough oil to burn the lamps for one day, and it took 8 days to reconsecrate that oil. And so they burned the lamp, and the miracle was that the lamp burned for those 8 days until they had the oil to be able to continue lighting the lamp. So that is the story of the of Hanukkah and what is celebrated when Jews celebrate Hanukkah. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about Hanukkah. It's very interesting. It's a pretty minor holiday worldwide for Jews. It's become more major in the United States because its import has sort of been increased to rival Christmas, so that Jewish families and stuff can kind of have a similar experience to the American Christian Christmas, which has become an important part of United States culture. All right. It's also significant because the Hashmonean dynasty represents kind of a rise of this concept of Jewish power. Now, under King David and King Solomon, the Jewish empire was massive, and their armies were rivals to none, essentially. So now we see with the Hashmoneans a rise of kind of a return to this concept of Jewish power, no longer being subjugated to those around you, but taking the control for themselves and not being a passive people to these empires. Now, unfortunately, that didn't last long, but the influence that the Hashmoneans had has been pulled from for multiple times throughout Jewish history. This remembrance of the strength of Jewish arms. Um, a quick point on the Jewish on the I'm sorry, the King David, the Davidic line and the authority. I'm sorry, that simple word. I was looking for authority. So the Hashmoneans did not have kingly authority. They didn't come from the line of David. So they were kings more along the lines of the kings of Israel in the north that didn't come from the Davidic dynasty. But they still had more authority, and that's probably what garnered them the support even of the religious elites. They had more authority to claim leadership over the Jewish people than did the Greeks or any outside influence. So then we have in 63 BCE, Rome rises and actually assaults Israel and conquers Jerusalem, takes control of the temple in 63 BCE, and we see an end to the Hashmonean dynasty at that point. All right, so the conqueror of Rome, and we know that Rome, rises up and conquers the Greek Empire, and just as is the fate of Israel was transferred from the Babylonians to the Persians, ultimately the Greeks, and now the Romans are the key players and figures in the area. They conquer Israel and take the temple in 63 BCE. And that introduces basically this period of time that is referred to as the Second Temple period. Very significant and important time. This is the time in which Jesus of Nazareth lived, a time of the New Testament, effectively. And it's a time when Jews were under the control of the Romans, and the Romans had an active involvement in the administration of their controlled kind of cities and populations. King Herod is a significant figure. Now, he was an Edomite, which is a group of people that were forcibly converted to Judaism approximately 100 years before this time. So he wasn't even kind of an ethnic Jew that came from the Hebrew peoples. He was an Edomite, eventually curried favor with the Romans, and was appointed, and partially through force of arms and his own influence, was appointed to be king of Israel. Now, he tried to kind of solidify his authority. He actually abandoned his wife and his child and married a Hasmonean princess to try to connect himself to the Hashmonean dynasty. That didn't work very well, but what did work was effectively what he did as king of the Jews under the control of the Romans, is that he embarked in major reconstructive projects, rebuilding cities. His most significant and influential project, and the one that probably allowed the Jewish people to just sort of stomach his his control and his reign is that he rebuilt the temple. You see, before, Temple of Zerubbabel, pretty small and modest. Now the Temple of Herod was one of the largest structures in the ancient world. Beautiful, ornate. He expanded all of this area, built the new corridors or the new areas of the temple. Built the retaining wall around the Temple Mount. Those of you that have been to Israel or have seen pictures see the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall is supposed to be one of the last remaining walls of the Temple of Herod, and it's not one of these walls, it's one of the outer retaining walls. It was torn down by the Romans, rebuilt by subsequent Muslim empires. The stones were placed on each other. So the way that it looks now, if you look at the Western Wall, isn't really the way that it would have looked. What you have to do is go underground, and there's these amazing tours you can take where you can go underground and see the stones placed on each other and how ornate and beautiful they are. And so you can see some of the original stonework of the temple. Another significant figure I want to talk about for a moment is Josephus. He was a leader in a Jewish revolt that we'll talk about in a little bit that ultimately defected over to the Romans, and the Romans basically put him up as an historian. And he wrote a significant amount of Jewish history during the Second Temple period. So he's one of our only Jewish sources. During that time, we have the Christian New Testament and the writings, but very few Jewish sources. Josephus is probably the most important. Now, there's some problems with his writings, but basically it's what we've got. And so, very significant individual to know and an important name to know. Another significant figure, obviously, Jesus of Nazareth. I put in here false Messiah because that was one of the key ways in which he's viewed by Jews, as somebody that claimed to be the Messiah, and Jews accordingly believing that he was not the Messiah. We know from those that are familiar with the New Testament that the New Testament is rife with conflict between the Jews and the Romans. And Jesus entered the story in the midst of that conflict. And so when he claimed to be the Messiah or the Savior, effectively, many people believe that he was claiming that he could free the Jews from the Romans. And so the miracles that he was performing was proof positive in the eyes of many Jews that he had power and ultimately would use that power to conquer the Romans. I'm not, going to spend a lot of time talking about kind of the different ways in which Jews versus Christians view Jesus, but simply that he claimed messianic authority and Jews believed that he was not the Messiah, effectively. And this concept of deicide is important, essential to understanding anti-Semitism, which is the hatred of Jews, and that is the attributing of Jesus' death to the Jewish people as a whole, and basically identifying that what happened to the Jews after the death of Jesus was the retribution of God throughout time for their decision to reject the Messiah and to kill Jesus. Deicide means basically the killing of a god. Now, the reason I mention it is because it's one of the most foundational tropes to anti-Semitism. It's one of the very first concepts of why Jews are maligned and hated throughout time. And we will get to a module on just anti-Semitism, and we'll talk again about this. We'll do some readings of early Christian fathers and leaders that taught and preached this concept of anti-Semitism and of the Jews being rejected by God. Okay, so the Roman revolt is effectively when all of this thing that we were talking about in the New Testament, all of this kind of the fomenting opposition to the Romans and this conflict eventually comes to a head in this major Jewish-Roman war and revolt in 66 CE to 71 CE, and it ends with the destruction of the temple and the defeat of the Jews. And the Romans take an even tighter stranglehold over the Jews. They destroy the temple and tear it down stone for stone. So again, we see this extremely sad return to where we started at the beginning of the module with the Temple of Solomon being destroyed by the Babylonians. Now we have different empire, different time, same idea. The Romans tearing down the temple stone for stone, and once again the Jews having to ask themselves, how do we continue moving forward? Because we're talking about At this point, Jews had had hundreds of years with the temple again after the restoration of the temple of Zerubbabel. So generation upon generation of Jews that had practiced their faith through this temple um, cult of worship. All right. So the next major revolt is the Bar Kokhba revolt. That happens in 132 to 135 CE. That's another major war that takes place. And Bar Kokhba is another false Messiah as designated by Jews. He claimed to be the Messiah, and he had support and influence from significant members of the religious and spiritual community. Rabbi Akiva, who was a significant and influential rabbi at the time, proclaimed Bar Kokhba, Simon Bar Kokhba, to be the Messiah, and that he would restore the Jewish power and authority and defeat the Romans. And a major battle and major war ensued, which ultimately led to destruction of the Jewish people on the proportions of the Holocaust. That's why I put Holocaust here, because 580,000 Jews were killed. At the time, it was estimated that there were only around 4 million. Some scholars think that that is even high. 4 million Jews worldwide, and almost 600,000 of them are destroyed. That's, almost 1/5 to 1/4 or so, depending on the total number of Jews of the Jewish community worldwide that are suddenly gone and destroyed. So absolutely devastating to Jews. And what's equally and symbolically devastating is that Jews are expelled from Jerusalem, according to Christian sources. But we know effectively that Jews were driven out at that point, and there was not a significant Jewish presence in the land of Jerusalem. So next week we're going to talk about how Jews chose to, or how they kind of responded to this, because it would have been understandable if this is the end of the story, and that's how an ancient Semitic tribe that became to be known as the Jews ultimately met their defeat and demise. But that, as we know, is not the end of the story. So how does Judaism survive? I've given us some, ways to understand this, interpret this, because Jews have gone through this before. So ask yourselves these questions throughout this week as you do the readings and as you prepare for next week as well when we answer this question. How does Judaism survive? No promised land, no holy city, no temple, no kingdom, and then the rise of these outside, not just empires, but influential religious organizations that become tied to empires. So the rise of Christianity and ultimately the rise of Islam. How does Judaism survive throughout all of this? It's an exciting story, and I'm excited to get to the next chapter of it next week. Please let me know if you have any questions. Don't hesitate to reach out, and I hope you have a great week.